Hey guys, it's me, Amaterasu, back with part 2 to What If Deku Was a Villain, aka All for Some. Anyways, today I will be uploading this obviously, part 3 to Senju Naruto, and finally God of Flames Deku, oh and maybe a new series. But anyways, roll the intro.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
My wheels got in my bag and I got all my feels. I'm getting this paper, I'm stacking a meal. I'm with your hoe in the house on the hills. Yeah. I'ma keep it real, had to sacrifice to try to get my bands up. Shorty wanna fuck with me, she see me on the camera. She said she in love with me, but really I can't stand her. She just want part of this life cause she see me on the ground.
Chapter 4, Father and Son. I'm going mom, Izuku announced while putting on his shoes. His voice, as most days recently, was more cheerful than it had been in years. His mother rushed into the hall to see him. Not until you tell how you are feeling, honestly. Bit of a headache and I think I'm still getting tired faster, but no dizziness since last week. See, Izuku responded. To prove he was telling the truth, he raised his left leg and stood on one foot before hopping close enough to hug his mother. Don't listen to your classmates, don't stay with your father too late, and don't believe a word he says. Izuku chuckled at his mother's standard instructions. Despite her words and a reasonable suspicion towards his dad, Izuku knew she had been happier since they had been reunited, even if she told him to stop spying on her. It might have been solely because Izuku was happier to have both his parents in his life, but he was grateful for anything that made his mother happy and didn't mind wearing the tracker watch either. There were still issues in his life. His mother's first instruction was even harder to follow now that he knew his father was a villain, and they made Izuku think more about his words violating his mother's third instruction. He forced those thoughts out of his mind before pulling away from the hug. His mother deserved this happiness without starting a discussion on the flaws of society. Instead, he grinned. I'll try not to stay too late, but Dad promised he'd start teaching me more about my quirks since I've gotten better now. Izuku pushed the door open and left before he made either of them cry. He didn't want to go to school in wet clothes even if the weather was sunny. He walked enjoying the spring day, completely ignoring he'd still have to spend hours in the hellhole they called school. At least he had a lesson with Kuro-sensei after lunch. His calm ended when a loud roar echoed along the street. He looked to the side on an intersection. A giant man was standing on an elevated railroad roaring. He swung his arm, knocking down one of the support pillars of the overhead electric cables. Izuku gasped, but something grabbed the pillar before it could prove a real threat to the bystanders, and he could hear people start talking vibrantly about the hero death arms. Izuku already had notes on him, so he focused on the giant criminal. A gigantification quirk, Izuku muttered. He pulled out his notebook to add notes about the unknown giant as someone nearby verbally mocked the giant for doing small crime with a quirk like that. It wasn't like he could use the quirk much with how the laws were without breaking the law or managing to become a hero. Did they want him to commit worse crime then? Not that going on a rampage like that made sense either. Considering how agitated the giant seemed to be, he was probably at his max size and it came with some mutations in his head shape. Something whooshed over Izuku. It didn't take long for him to recognize the hero Kamui Woods. Izuku forgot the simple gigantification quirk and focused on the hero's arbor quirk. On the surface the wooden body that could stretch and split was obvious, but Izuku didn't have a clue about the actual limits or capabilities of the quirk beyond that. After evading a few swings, the hero prepared to launch his special binding move only for another giant person to appear and kick the criminal out of the way, causing considerable collateral damage to the street below in the process. No one cared though, since the giant hero was a good-looking young woman, and people were more interested in taking pictures than complaining about unnecessary damage. Izuku put his notebook away and continued toward school. The school day, first of the new school year, started normal enough with no one talking to or approaching Izuku. He for his part focused on thinking of how to get his parents to get along better. Despite being about family conflict, it was a hopeful train of thought to him. He barely noticed the glares of his classmates as he walked past them to his lonely desk. The teacher came in the classroom right after Izuku. He was one of the worst ones in the school and had for years ignored anything Bakugo and others had done to Izuku with no consideration for how his own actions might impact the ostracized student. Not surprising considering how he always praised students with strong showy quirks, talking about how he dreamed of having a student of his become a great hero someday. And so began the first lesson of the school year. You are all third years now, The teacher started and grabbed a pile of papers from his desk. It's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. I would hand out these future career forms, but I assume you all want to be heroes. He threw the papers in the air with the final declaration as the entire class got exited and started showing off their quirks. Izuku held back a grimace. Encouraging was one thing, Izuku had desperately needed someone to do so for years, but there was no way everyone or even most of the class would ever become heroes. The man completely failed to guide any student who wasn't up to the most demanding and selective career path there was. The man continued talking. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, but you know that it's against the rules to use them in school. The reminder of rules was not especially stern. Sensei! Bakugo shouted. Don't lump me in with these losers, as if I had anything like their crappy quirks. Hey! Of course, he only cared about the superiority of his quirk, not that most of the class had the drive to really become heroes anyway. Izuku hated to admit it, but Bakugo was the one with the best chances, ignoring his attitude. His behavior was far from that of a hero, but no hero school entrance exam had a test for garbage personality. Everyone in the class recognized this, shouting at the bully to get over himself only to be called extras. Ah, Bakugo. You, of course, the teacher started, his voice getting more enthusiastic with every word. Must be aiming for UA High School. The declaration made the class gasp, reciting the difficulty of getting into the top school. Bakugo jumped on his desk to stand over the rest of the class and declared his greatness and his goal to become the best hero. To become rich mainly, he wasn't afraid to say. He was the poster child of why hero schools needed better vetting for their students, not that they cared. The heroes teaching at the schools obviously benefited from the high-paying celebrity status no matter what kind of people it attracted. While Bakugo was posturing, the teacher decided to drop a verbal bomb on Izuku. Weren't you also going for UA Midoriya? Bakugo fell silent for a moment along with the whole class. It ended as soon as it had begun when they burst into laughter and mockery. Huh, Midoriya? No way. A villain at the top hero school? Yeah, right. He'd have better chance if he was quirkless. He's seriously still thinking that he will be something. Izuku stayed in his seat, eyes focused on his notebook without responding to the garbage he'd have to take for another year, at least probably rest of his life. The teacher did nothing to stop it. Izuku tried to distract himself by imagining how things would have gone if it was Kuro-sensei's class, but thinking of what Kuro-sensei might have done in this situation made him remember what happened to the man that had caused his brain damage, how his face had twisted in horror and his screams had filled the room they had been in. Izuku shivered and focused on staring at his notebook. Eventually the teacher concluded that, despite his ignoring the career guidance process, he would still hold some form of a lesson and told the class to sit and quiet down. The remainder of the lesson passed for Izuku in a haze. It was nothing new, but the contrast to his earlier happy thoughts was a big one. The incident at the beginning of class had also reminded him of another problem. What would he do with his life? For most of his childhood he had dreamed of becoming a hero. That's why he had also expressed interest for UA. Recently he had not been so sure. The more he thought about everything wrong in the world, the less attractive being a hero seemed, even if he wanted to help people. Even if becoming one would have been the biggest possible middle finger to Bakugo and their classmates. Meeting his father and talking about the meanings of heroes and villains had done nothing to make him more excited of being a hero. Still, he didn't know anything else he wanted. What career could he do, let alone want to do? He just said UA if anyone asked what school he wanted to go to, got laughed at and moved on. If nothing else, it was a prestigious school even outside the hero course. The class came to an end with Izuku still in his thoughts, not even scribbling anymore, his notebook laying closed on the desk. A hand reached out to grab the notebook and took it away before Izuku realized what had happened. He followed the notebook to Bakugo, who had already taken a step back from Izuku's reach. He had his usual arrogant expression with a tint of wariness in his eyes that did not slip past Izuku's notice. We ain't done here, Deku. What's that, Katsuki? One of Bakugo's goons asked. Quirk analysis for my future? Seriously, this guy. Are you looking for good quirks to steal? Oh come on, Izuku said, tired of the shit. Give it back. Without a word Bakugo slapped his hands on each side of the notebook, releasing small explosions from both. Izuku froze for a moment. The notebook's covers were all torn up and the whole thing was blackened and smoking. Why? He whispered. Bakugo just tossed the notebook over his shoulder and out the window. The best heroes out there, well ... and quad. Bakugo started. They showed signs of greatness even as students. I'll be the first and only hero from this crappy public middle school. The first to win the honor of becoming a student at UA High Hero course. Guess I'm just a perfectionist. Bakugo held his hands open as smoke rose from them. Izuku turned his head away, looking at the open window rather than listening to the walking garbage fire. In other words, don't you dare to apply to UA nerd, not even the general studies for losers that can't be heroes. Failing to get a reaction, the trio of bullies started leaving as Izuku still stared out of the window. Of course they kept jeering at him as they went. Then Bakugo said it. You want to be a hero so bad? I've got a time-saving idea for you. If you think you'll have a more heroic quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku shook as he heard the words. He spun around, his open palm up, power of all for one crackling within his body. Bakugo tensed and quickly took a defensive stance with one of his hands also raised, explosions flashing from it. He was holding his other hand much lower but open, clearly ready to blast the entire room if Izuku moved. Don't you try. After confirming Izuku wasn't moving, Bakugo left with a sneer, leaving him alone in the empty class. Izuku sighed and, after waiting a moment, he departed the now empty classroom, heading to the yard. Of course, his notebook had landed in the fish pool that the school had. For a second Izuku thought he should do something. This was a new low even for Bakugo. He gave up the thought. It wasn't like the school was going to do anything. Maybe if he didn't have his parents and took Bakugo's advice to jump off the roof. For anything less, it was pointless to complain to teachers about the school's #1 candidate for future hero. He stayed there leaning over the water. He brought his free hand on his head. What's the point? Young Midoriya? Izuku turns to see Kurogiri in his human form, though with plenty of mist leaking from behind his ears. Izuku squeezed his hands into a fist, pulling his own hair and grumbling about the already abused notebook. Take me to my dad, was all he said. Izuku stepped out of the darkness of Kurogiri's warp gate and squinted his eyes. He was not in the dimly lit room full of medical equipment. If anything, the room was as far from it as possible. He was standing in the middle of a luxurious living room with large windows on two sides that exposed the city below. It took a few seconds for Izuku to recognize the city as Tokyo, and he was near the top of some skyscraper overlooking it. Was this where his father had lived all these years? Izuku? Izuku turned around to face his father. For the first time the man was not dressed in his fine suit but a simple white-collared shirt and black jeans. He had the lower half of his helmet on for its breathing assistance. He came closer to Izuku. Even with most of his face gone, there was visible tenseness around the breathing mask. Did your symptoms get worse again? No, school did, Izuku responded, gritting his teeth. He sat on the nearest sofa, slumped against the backrest, staring at the ceiling. I would ask what happened, but Kurogiri has kept me well informed, better than you have with your mother, his father said and sat next to Izuku. Wah? What do you mean? If she knew half of what Kurogiri has reported to me, you would not be in that place anymore. I'm surprised she had you go in such an average school in the first place. It's the school for the area we have always lived in, and I don't want to worry her. It's not like things would be any better anywhere else anyway. I would still have had to either pretend to be quirkless or deal with them knowing I have your quirk. Sorry, I didn't mean. It's just how people view it. That is okay, Izuku. I know well how this society works. I saw its formation. Izuku sighed. Some days I wish you could have replaced all of the teachers with Kurogirus. That might have been a challenge to do without raising suspicion even for me. It has been difficult enough to keep one of him from going too far. You should have noticed by now he has become protective over you, even beyond what his job requires. I did notice. He wanted to burn the school while you were sick to have you transferred without talking to Inko. I have wondered how much that was impacted by my genes and quirk within you. What do you mean? Izuku asked and raised his head. It's a matter that concerns my villain activities, some you might find difficult to accept despite how you might feel about this society. I see. And quat. This time Izuku looked down. But if it's about Kuro-sensei, if our quirk does something to him. Izuku looked at his palm. I'll keep whatever you say secret, but I'd like to know. Father got up and touched his chin. He stepped in front of Izuku. I guess it will help you decide if you can truly accept my presence without covering it in ignorance. Kurogiri is not fully human. Anymore. Not human. He used to be. Resisting the society itself and those who created it requires force with unstoppable power and unquestionable loyalty. The doctor has spent years studying myself to modify human bodies to sustain multiple quirks. You should never give people quirks carelessly, by the way, at least no more than one, and nothing highly powerful. Not unless you want to risk them becoming vegetables. Most people's bodies don't adapt to a growing number of different quirks like ours. Izuku gulped. The injury won't be permanent if you remove the quirk quickly enough, and people can usually adapt better if new quirks relate to their original ones, but even then, it is limited. So, the doctor and I found a way to create artificial humans that were created specifically to hold multiple quirks or quirk combinations. Before you said he was modifying human bodies, not creating them? Izuku said. As his father kept facing him wordlessly, he had his answer. Dad. Was he dead or alive when you changed him? Dying. So, you could say you saved him by making him Nomu, and that depends on what you consider saving a person. Kurogiri's body might be a modified version of his old one, but his mind is entirely artificial. His body was more adaptive to new quirks than most, so his brain could recover enough to build a new personality over time, though still with absolute loyalty, one tied to my genes and the quirk that helped create him, which you share. I never told him to obey you, only to protect, yet he seems to do both. Izuku stared at his father and new tears started dripping to his already drying cheeks. He slumped down holding his face in his hands. Figures that the only person who cared about me did so only because he was forced to by my quirk. Oh, I very much doubt that. If his actions were solely directed by our quirk's power over him, I would only have needed to command him once to restrain his actions. Unless you commanded him to burn the school or leak mist whenever you get abused? The words were strangely comforting, but at best they left Izuku confused instead of grieving. Is there any way to know? If you want to see what he would do, you can watch your words. Avoid anything that he can consider an order and see what happens. I will. Izuku sat in silence for a long time, still holding his face. His father left the room at some point. Only when he returned and spoke did Izuku raise his head and lean back. You can sit here as long as you want, but if you want to use this time effectively, there is more you should learn about your quirk. The risk of giving them is only a small part. Or perhaps you want to talk about school? Aren't fathers and sons supposed to talk about school? He placed a jug of juice and a pair of glasses on a table in front of the sofa. I shouldn't listen to them. It's not like I put much value in their opinions, but it's the same every single day. Izuku sighed and stared forward at nothing. I'm so tired of it. They sat in silence for a moment before Izuku continued. Can we talk about quirks instead? Of course. Have you tried using your new quirks? I figured out how to activate them, but I can't control them well and they remind me about how I got them. So, you need to learn control and help to get over those events. If we're lucky, both have the same solution. Izuku stared at him questioningly. If those quirks are tied to your memories of the events, then having control over them might help you control your feelings of those events. Now get up. And quat. They stood and he led Izuku to an open space between the sofas and a large dining table. Show me one of the quirks. Izuku did as he was told, and a few seconds later an oval-shaped mass of flames lit over the back of his palm, licking his skin. It didn't quite burn him, but the heat was still uncomfortable. Seeing the flames, he started immediately breathing faster and turned his head. Father placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder as other came to the side of his head, pushing it back. Look at it. Forget where it came from. This is your power now, and it will bend to your will like all others. Forced to look at the flaming quirk, Izuku was able to gradually control his breathing. He forced the memories to the back of his thoughts. You are in control of yourself. Good. Let's see if you can get it to change form to something more useful. Figuring how to manipulate something that till recently did not exist in his body was even more challenging than Izuku had expected, but his father's advice and constant presence helped greatly. He soon forgot school and the crap people in his life. The day flew by. Izuku only realized the time when he looked out of the large windows to see the sun halfway below the horizon. Perhaps you should head home now, his father said. You will need to study what you missed today. Kurogiri can cover your absence with school administration to a point, but he cannot study for you or calm Inko. If you think so, Izuku said. One more time he activated the flaming blade, no, the dragon blade he decided to name it, and forced it to stretch out into a more sword-like shape. He looked at it for a moment. It brought back the memories, but his breathing remained steady. He could control both of them, his lungs and his quirk. If you keep training, I will teach you how to combine and use multiple quirks simultaneously, his father promised, making Izuku smile. Izuku soon stepped out of Kurogiri's portal in his own backyard. He wanted to say something to the Misty Nomu, but did not know what to say. He could only thank Kurogiri before stepping in the mist. He headed straight to the back door, a little surprised at the dark building. He checked his phone still on silent mode from school. There was one message from his mother about being out in case he returned first. She didn't mention anything about school to Izuku's relief. His father had fed him, so he went straight to his room to study, just briefly glancing at a news feed on his phone. There were some titles about the fight in the morning, but most others were about something called sludge villain attack, 1 dead. Izuku would have read further, but he reached his room. He put down the phone to change clothes, grimacing a little at singe marks on his sleeve. He was lucky to not have lit his clothes on fire. He was just taking his books from his backpack when the doorbell rang. He headed to the door a little wary, taking his phone with him. They didn't have visitors often, maybe Bakugo's mom Mitsuki sometimes. The mothers had a much better relationship than their sons, just one more reason for Izuku to not talk about everything that happened at school. He opened the front door. He did not expect 2 police officers and some middle-aged woman in civilian clothing, all of them with serious expressions. Izuku's heart skipped a beat. Chapter 5, The News. Izuku stared at the trio at his door as dread consumed him. When he met the eyes of the civilian woman, his own began to tear up. Are you Izuku Midoriya? One of the police asked. Izuku could only nod. Is your father home? Izuku gulped. No, he's away a lot because of his work. Please tell me what's going on. Your mother Inko Midoriya was killed earlier today by a villain. Izuku stood in front of them with shaky legs that soon collapsed as he fell to his knees on the doorstep. He grabbed his chest. He was gasping for air, barely able to breathe, like something was squeezing his throat. The middle-aged woman pushed through between the two police officers and kneeled to embrace Izuku in her arms. Oh, for goodness sake, have you ever told these kinds of news to a kid? She said, and then spoke to Izuku in softer tones. I am a social worker. You can call me Anisha. We will explain everything and get you anything you need, but you should be sitting for that. May we have your permission to come in? The only sound Izuku could make was quiet sniffing, but he nodded to her. Thank you. Don't worry about crying. You don't need to keep anything in. Anisha escorted Izuku inside, still holding him close. She settled him on the big sofa and let him stare into the empty air for a long time. And quat. Izuku rasped. What happened? Anisha nodded to the police officers. There was a villain with a quirk that turned his body into a sludge form. He was being chased after a robbery. We believe that he wanted to utilize his quirk to hide in your mother's body and use it to escape. Izuku gagged loudly and felt a new clump in his throat. The sludge villain. You know him? One of the police asked. I saw a headline. Izuku paused to sob. I didn't have time to read Mo. There was a video. He scrambled to get his phone. Anisha put her hand on his. I would not recommend you watch that. Dealing with a loss like this takes time. It may be too much right away. Izuku yanked his phone from her grasp. It's already too much. I still need to see for myself, to know. He quickly found the news again and pulled up a video. The situation was already going on when the camera had started. A gas station had been damaged and caught fire. In the middle of it all was the sludge villain, not even human-shaped, only recognizable as a person because it had an oversized face with a wicked evil grin, and under it, being pulled up to the sludge, was a human shape. The image was too small to truly identify the person, but Izuku knew. A group of heroes led by the Death Arm were at the scene. They grabbed a few civilians caught in the middle of things and retreated with them. Death Arm attacked the villain once, then he ran away. The heroes withdrew further away from the villain, not even trying to help his mom anymore. Mount Lady was stuck on some smaller street, too stupid to shrink so she could get closer. Izuku started shaking as the video progressed, but not of grief. Why aren't they doing anything? Izuku screamed. The camera moved from the useless heroes to the sludge monster and his still struggling victim. There was a sudden movement and she bent backwards in a snapping motion and stopped. Izuku stopped breathing. His dinner tried to climb up his throat. He couldn't see the video anymore as both his eyes and the screen were wet with tears. He could barely hear the pompous declaration that he used to love, but now only felt rage. It is fine now. Why? Because I am here. No, it's not, Izuku muttered, and with a scream threw the phone across the room, almost hitting one of the police officers. Hey, watch it. They did nothing, Izuku shouted, ignoring the police. Heroes are supposed to help people, risk their lives to help people, and they just watched her die. They threw one punch and gave up. And where are they now? Not here for sure. That is easy to say watching videos from a nice sofa. You don't know what their work involves. They're busy with more urgent things. What do you think you're doing? Anisha hissed at the police. Izuku didn't care about her, the police officer's words echoing in his mind. They don't look that busy when there are cameras around. Yes, let it all out. Seeking someone to blame is normal. You will get over it, Anisha said. Izuku tensed and began shaking. Over it? You expect me to watch so-called heroes not even trying to do their job and act like that's okay and normal? It might be normal, but it's not okay. He raised his head just in time to see one of the police open his mouth to say something again. Izuku's wet eyes narrowed. Get out. Excuse me? The officer raised his eyebrows. You've told me what you needed to and more. Now, get out of my home. Hold on, I know you're sad and angry, but you shouldn't be alone today, and we need to determine what happens to you next. Anisha tried to reason in a soothing voice. No, you don't. I still have a father. Izuku pulled away from Anisha's grasp and started stumbling towards his phone next to the wall. That might be the case, but you said he is not here right now. You still shouldn't be alone. We have facilities and people that take care of people in situations like yours. Izuku took the phone. Despite a seriously cracked screen, it still seemed to work. He hesitated with calling his father right away. Talking with a top-level villain in front of two police officers didn't seem smart, but they also weren't listening to him, as if he was a little kid. He didn't have time to make the call as his phone began ringing. It was his father's number. Izuku took a shaky breath before answering. Dad, his father's voice was calm, but faster than usually. Izuku, we need to talk. I know, Izuku cried out. Police just came here with some social worker to tell me. Mom. She's gone. I see, his father responded in a more somber tone. I will get you. Thanks, Dad. They want to take me somewhere. They think it's better than being alone until you get here, but... He was interrupted by the doorbell ringing repeatedly. Everyone went quiet for a moment. Sorry, someone else is at the door, Izuku said. You should see who it is, his father advised. It may help us decide what you should do next. Izuku walked to the door. The police officers followed but kept a little distance. Izuku opened the door and was instantly grabbed into a hug by a teary-eyed Mitsuki Bakugo. Izuku froze, uncertain of how to react. The woman had been a good friend to his mother, but she also raised the greatest torment in his life. Izuku, she started. Inko, she's I know, Izuku shouted as the sad cry was tainted by annoyance. He pulled out of Mitsuki's hold. What are you doing here? What am I? I came to make sure you're okay. So, you don't need to be alone. I am not okay, and you can't help it. None of you can dot and quat. Izuku raised his voice and looked back at the earlier trio, making Mitsuki notice them too. I just want to be left alone so I can talk with Dad without having to deal with all of you pretending you care or can help somehow. Izuku, the sound from the phone was barely loud enough for Izuku to notice. He brought the phone back to his ear. If the police don't want to leave you alone, you should ask if your mother's friend can stay with you until I get to you. She should be easier to handle than the authorities, if you can handle a Bakugo that is. I will. Get a flight and be there in the morning. You can call me again when you get more privacy. Morning. Okay, I'll try that dot and quat. Izuku sighed and ended the call. He looked at the police and Anisha with tired annoyance and pointed at Mitsuki. She's been my mother's friend almost as long as I've been alive. Will you leave me alone if she sticks around until my dad gets here? The police officers looked at each other and Anisha spoke first. It should be okay. It's always better to stay with someone you are familiar with. We need to confirm her identity before leaving. Fine, do that and get out. He walked past them back inside. He wanted to go straight to his room and be alone, but Mitsuki would only follow him there. Instead, he collapsed on the sofa, exhausted from dealing with people. He didn't take his eyes away from the ceiling even as steps approached. Mitsuki kneeled next to him. Izuku. Izuku did not respond. Izuku, please look at me. Why? Izuku said without looking at her. You're only here so I don't need to deal with those other people. Otherwise, I would not want to be anywhere near a Bakugo right now, or ever. What's that supposed to mean? The woman's fiery personality started leaking into her words despite everything that had happened. Izuku grimaced. He could almost see Katsuki in her place. You raised Bakugo Katsuki, right? Of course I raised my son. So, you are at least as shit a parent as he is a person. Now you listen too. No, Izuku shouted and got up from the sofa. You listen to me. Your son is a walking garbage fire you threw dynamite into. He is the bane of my life. He is worse than everyone else at school combined. Just today he mocked me in front of the whole class, blew up my notebook and told me to kill myself. Izuku paused, breathing fast like he had just run a marathon. He was too tired to be polite and watch his words like he usually did. Mitsuki on the other hand seemed to have forgotten how to speak as she stared at Izuku. I never knew, she gasped. Of course you didn't. No one cares if an outcast gets tormented, especially when everyone thinks the bully might get into a hero school even if it's only by luck of birth. What's the life of one worthless kid if school can get such prestige? But why didn't you say anything until now? Izuku got up and turned away. Not like it would have helped much, it's the same everywhere. Plus, Mom didn't have many friends besides you, not a problem anymore. And I was afraid what Bakugo Katsuki might do. Izuku sighed. I think I'll want to start over somewhere else with Dad. The further away it is from your family the better. He started walking away. If you have to stay, stay downstairs. I'm happier if I don't need to see you or your family ever again. No, she said. Izuku stopped. If what you are telling me is true, I need to get to the bottom of it and straighten the brat. I'll call him here and we can fix it. Izuku spun around, activating his new dragon blade quirk and pointed it right at Mitsuki's face. Izuku's arm shook so much it was visible even on the already wavy blade. They stared at each other for a while, neither daring to say a word until Izuku's arm dropped and the fire disappeared. Izuku stared at the floor away from Mitsuki. It took him a moment to regain control over his own mouth as he grabbed his face with the same hand he had just threatened Mitsuki with. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that, but I don't want to deal with your son, especially not today. No, I should be the one to apologize, but what? Was that quirk? Izuku completed the question and looked at the hole in his palm. I was kidnapped a while back and had to take it from one of the kidnappers. I haven't shown it to anyone since they would just accuse me of stealing it, Katsuki especially. Now can I go back to cry in my room, or do you still need something from me? Kitten. Of course, I'll stay down here for tonight. In case you need to talk to someone. Izuku walked upstairs without saying anything more, entered his room and collapsed on the bed face down. In seconds, the pillow was soaked wet as he began sobbing. Time passed, Izuku didn't know how much. It was completely dark once he raised his head. He turned onto his back and took out the cracked phone. He thought about calling his father again, but the video was still open. It hurt to even think about it, but he could not turn away from his mother's last moments alive even if they were horrifying. Even after crying for so long, he had to watch the video several times to clear his eyes of tears before he could really see it. With every viewing, his anger at the heroes rose, and All Might's words especially caused him to boil inside. The supposed hero punched away the villain too late and dared to stand there, over the dead corpse of Izuku's mother, like he had achieved some kind of glorious victory. Izuku's eyes rose to his All Might posters and a shelf full of All Might merch he had gathered over the years. His fanboying over the hero had degraded over time, but all the stuff was still in his room and now he only saw red looking at them. He jumped off the bed and rushed across the room. The fiery blades appeared from both of his hands and he started slashing at the posters. The quirk burned through the posters, leaving black lines of scorched smoking wall, but didn't cut as well as one might have expected from a quirk called a blade and quad. He stopped for a moment, staring at the All Might figurines and other merch, focusing his anger even further. In his eyes he only saw the supposed symbol of peace standing victoriously over the defeated sludge villain, as if he hadn't even noticed the corpse next to him. Barely thinking, Izuku tapped into all his quirks. The blade twisted and narrowed and started to vibrate. After a few seconds, any restraint broke, and with a roar of anger and agony Izuku swung his arms forward, cutting through not just the figurines but the shelves and into the wall behind. Wood smoked, plastic melted and paper instantly caught fire with open flame. After several swings the whole bookshelf collapsed into a smoking pile, forcing Izuku to jump back. Running steps echoed from behind his door and without even knocking Mitsuki ran inside. Are you? She paused mid-sentence. Izuku was still staring at the pile of what he had destroyed, calming barely enough to deactivate his quirk. Mitsuki stepped past him and rummaged around her purse. She pulled out a miniature fire extinguisher and sprayed with it wherever she saw smoke, even digging into the pile of rubble to make sure she got all of the flames. Once the extinguisher was empty, she turned slowly to Izuku and gulped. Are you okay? I mean physically. Yes, Izuku responded and sat down on his bed. He pointed at the pile of rubble that was no longer smoldering. Thanks for that. It's not the first time I've had to put out fires. Katsuki. Sorry, you don't want to talk about him. She paused for a moment and gestured to the rubble. Do you want to talk about this? Yes, but not with you, Izuku answered and picked up his phone. At least Mitsuki listened and turned to leave. Then she stopped and Izuku groaned internally. She pulled something else from her purse, a letter. Your mother left this with me. She told me to keep it in case something happened to her. I was supposed to open it if anything happened, but since you are here. Izuku's eyes widened, remembering his mother's threat. Just so you know, I left a letter explaining the situation with someone you don't know. If anything happens to either of us, it goes to the police. He reached out to grab the letter and hold it against his chest. Thank you. She looked at him for a while but left without complaint. Izuku sat on the bed, phone on his ear. Dad. He talked for a long time, laying down and falling into a restless sleep at some point mid-call. Nightmares of his kidnapping had been replaced by visions of his mother covered in and broken by the sludge, with All Might's unending grin hovering above her. He snapped awake as soon as an alarm on his phone started ringing and sprang up to a sitting position with his arm up defensively. It took him a few seconds to realize this was not part of the dream. It was just morning and his normal school day wake-up time. He dragged himself to the bathroom and for the first time since getting the news saw himself in the mirror. His hair was even messier than usually. His cheeks and undersides of his eyes were reddened, and his eyes just seemed tired despite having just slept all night, as poor as the sleep had been. The weight of everything had pushed his shoulders and head down to the point he had to consciously turn upward to see his reflection. Izuku didn't feel any of the usual rush to get ready for school, so he decided to get a shower going and stand under the stream of hot water for an unknown amount of time. He only left after hearing the muted ring of his phone and ran to his room wet and naked to pick up the call. Dad? Yes. Do you still want to leave, completely? Yes, Izuku answered. Without Mom there is nothing for me here. Then pack what you need for the first few days. I will get you soon. I think Mitsuki Bakugo is still here. Don't worry, that is actually a good thing. Simply disappearing could raise suspicion. She can witness you leaving with your caring father. But you? Izuku started asking, remembering his father's appearance. I have my means. You don't need to worry about that in addition to everything else. Okay, Izuku said, and they ended the call. Still generally slumped and head down, Izuku stared at the small puddle he had dripped on the floor and went back to the bathroom to dry up. At least the shower had washed the worst marks of crying from his face. After dressing, he got out some suitcases from his mom's closet, barely holding back another wave of tears as he had to cross her bedroom. It did not take long to pack. He filled half the suitcases with his notebooks, school books and some important papers and dumped clothes on top of them. At the last moment he remembered to get some photo books from mother's drawers. He made sure to not look into them, knowing the photographs would break him. Coming back from his mother's bedroom, Izuku caught a faint scent of food coming from downstairs. Mitsuki really had stayed then. Listening to the quiet sounds of cooking, Izuku's self-control nearly broke again, imagining his mother preparing breakfast while the smell made his stomach growl. It couldn't be helped. He put the last of his things in the suitcases and started dragging them downstairs. The clanging of the wheeled suitcases attracted Mitsuki from the kitchen. "What are you doing?" "Dad is going to pick me up soon," Izuku responded in a monotone voice. "Did you make breakfast?" "Oh, yes." At least she did not try to push him to go to school. Izuku left the suitcases next to the stairs and headed past her to the kitchen. "Thank you." He was surprised arriving at the kitchen table. Mitsuki had raided through their cabinets and gone beyond expectations with a full Japanese breakfast with rice, natto, eggs, grilled fish and vegetable-heavy miso soup and tea. He looked up to Mitsuki, who stood right outside the kitchen, giving him space. "Sorry how I treated you last night. Despite everything else, you were still the only person who showed up without it being your job. I'm actually starting to feel a bit sad we might not meet again." "Don't say that," Mitsuki pleaded. "Even if you are going to live with your father elsewhere, you can still visit any time." "We'll see. Maybe after Katsuki moves away from your house." "Is it really? What all has he done?" Izuku kept looking at the woman, his eyes slowly turning sterner. "It's a long list. Might take some time to make. Do you want me to sort it alphabetically or chronologically?" Mitsuki stared at him for a moment but soon averted her gaze, her face tense. "I think you have already told me enough. I'll be in the living room if you need anything." Izuku had nothing to say to that. He just wanted to be outside of the blast zone before Mitsuki met her son the next time. He still found it difficult to stay annoyed at the woman while eating her cooking. He was just finishing when his phone notified him of a message. He glanced at it once and hurried to the front door. The man behind it was simultaneously familiar and not. His hair was almost identical to Izuku's but green as his had been before manifesting all for one. 2 pairs of green eyes met his, though they felt strangely empty. The man's lips were partially covered by his jacket's high collar turned upwards despite warm spring weather. He kneeled with arms open wide. "Izuku." If Izuku had any doubts of the new face, the voice made him certain it was his father. He jumped towards his father, bringing his own arms around him. As his head pressed against his father's neck, he felt something strange right under the man's chin, where he had a breathing tube. Izuku couldn't see it for some reason, but he could still feel it. It didn't matter. He stayed right there sobbing until his father let go and nudged him to do the same. Izuku gave his father some space, but even as he got up, the man put a hand on his shoulder. "It will be okay, son," he said and looked up. "I don't believe we have been introduced. My name is Hisashi Midoriya." "Mitsuki Bakugo." Izuku turned around to Mitsuki, who was looking at them from inside. "I want to thank you for supporting my son at this difficult time, and sticking with him even with the friction I heard there was." "Yes, seems I need to confront my own son on some things," she bowed. "I apologize for all the pain he has caused your son, for my failure as a parent. That is not my forgiveness to give, and I am not one who could comment on your parenting. All either of us can do is better than before." Izuku looked up at his father. It was strange to hear him talk about things like that. "That being said, I do have access to a great many very capable, very expensive, very ruthless investigators and lawyers, in case your son ever as much as looks at Izuku in a way either of us doesn't like," the man continued. That was more like what Izuku expected. "I understand," Mitsuki said, visibly tenser than before. "If there is anything else I can do, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you for your offer, but you have already done enough." "Izuku, did you finish packing yet?" "Almost. I just need to grab a couple more things." "Then you should do that. You said you wanted away from here." Izuku nodded and headed back inside. He got the suitcases from next to the staircase and pulled out additional clothes from the hallway cabinet. He shoved some shoes in the suitcases and as an afterthought stepped in the kitchen to inhale the rest of the tea. In a few minutes he was back at the door and turned off the last light. Mitsuki too had slipped her coat on and stepped out. "We'll be going now," Izuku's father said. He grabbed a suitcase with one hand and Izuku's shoulder with other. They walked to a large black car with tinted windows in front of the house. Mitsuki followed a few steps behind, but they loaded the luggage and entered to the back seat without a word. Inside, Izuku noticed Kurogiri in his human form on the driver's seat. As the car started moving, he took one more glance at the house he had lived in since birth, thinking briefly about all the now painful memories inside it. When it disappeared from his field of view, he felt he would never return. Chapter 6. What now? Izuku felt both loss and relief as the house disappeared behind a corner. Confused at his own emotions, he stared at the seat in front of him, shoulders sagged. It didn't last long as his father began making strange groans. The sight when Izuku turned made him gasp as his father's face morphed and twisted. The healthy skin and eyes lost their color and smoothness before shrinking into his head, leaving behind only the usual wrinkled and scarred skin. His father pulled down his collar that had helped hide the pipe hanging from his throat, attached to something small enough to hide under the jacket. He reached under the seat and pulled out the collar part of his helmet with its breathing mask attached. With the mask on, he drew a deep breath a few times with an audible hiss. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked. "Yes," his father answered. "I had to abandon most of my breathing aids to hide my state even with that shape-shifting quirk. My oxygen levels would have dropped a bit. And quat. He chuckled. "Haven't I become pathetic, unable to even breathe on my own?" "No," Izuku blurted out. "You've guarded me even when I didn't know it, saved me, healed me and even taught me about my quirks. You too, Kurogiri. None of that sounds pathetic to me. At least I can still impress my son. Hopefully that means I can offer comfort too. First, you should know that you don't need to worry about anything practical. I have started arranging things so you can live well and as normally as you want, though even now I cannot be present in your life as much as Inko was." Izuku nodded gratefully, but the mention of his mother brought tears back to his eyes. His father brought his arm over Izuku's shoulder and pulled him closer. The next moment the car was a lot darker and they were in some large windowless garage. Izuku glanced at Kurogiri, who was already stepping out. Izuku followed and did not need to be told to step into a warp gate that appeared in front of him. In an instant he was back in the luxurious apartment of the previous day, where he had been as Izuku choked a little, barely able to breathe as tears began flowing again. Only his father and Kurogiri were there. There was no one to confront, nothing to hide, nowhere to go and nothing that needed doing. For the first time he could just collapse. Kurogiri's misty form barely caught him as he did so literally. The mist felt soft and warm as it lifted him to a sofa. The sofa shifted a bit, followed by a familiar hand landing on Izuku's shoulder. No one said anything for a long time as Izuku thoroughly soaked the fine leather. Eventually he was too out of breath to cry and too dehydrated to produce any more tears, so he could only stare at the opposite window as his vision slowly returned to normal. He gasped, trying to take back control of his lungs. "Perhaps we should get a breathing machine for you too," his father said. Izuku tried to chuckle, but it hurt. Father continued, "I am glad that worked. Comforting in a situation like this is not among my strengths." Slowly Izuku sat up and stared at the floor. As he spoke it was barely a whisper. "She's really gone." "Yes," his father confirmed. "They didn't even try to stop him. They just watched her die." "The heroes?" I don't think I can call them that," Izuku said. His father pulled him closer. "Here, that is okay. You have lost so much because of those who are called heroes. We both have." They sat there in silence for some time before Izuku raised his head and looked at his father's mostly missing face. "Dad, how did you get your injuries? You really shouldn't worry about that now. I need to know. I have wanted to ask for a while, but it's what kept you from even visiting us, right? Maybe, without that we could have all been together yesterday and..." There was a pause of silence before his father spoke. "All Might," he said slowly. "He destroyed much of what I had built until we inevitably faced each other head on. It was the hardest battle I have ever experienced, and he only stopped once he thought I was dead. If it wasn't for the injuries I was able to inflict on him, he might have stayed to make sure the job was finished." After his father answered, Izuku looked away. "Heroes are supposed to capture villains, not. That only applies as long as it is convenient for the heroes and those in charge," his father interrupted Izuku. "It isn't even a secret if you think about it. The most popular heroes and those most expected to become heroes are those with flashy physical powers that are best suited to injure or kill, while people with mental or supportive quirks are lucky to become heroes at all, even when better suited at solving situations without violence. You have already seen this with Katsuki Bakugo. Besides All Might, even the number 2 hero's power is, above all else, best suited for maiming or killing people in one of the most painful ways possible. If someone considered a villain, anyone without a card declaring them a hero, burned people half as bad as he has done for even small-time villains, that person would go to Tartarus without a question." Izuku thought about his father's words. He was too shaken and winded to even begin muttering. Kurogiri quietly placed a bowl of katsudon in front of him. Realizing how late it was, gratefully Izuku took the bowl. After the first taste he started eating at an increasing speed, showing more energy than any time earlier that day. The instant he finished, Kurogiri was there to switch the katsudon bowl with a bowl of ice cream. Izuku nearly started crying again at the Nomu's kindness while his father never left the sofa. After the lunch, Kurogiri disappeared somewhere, leaving the two alone. Eventually Izuku was able to ask the one question he needed an answer to most. "Dad," he began, What's going to happen now? Are we going to live here? No, this place is under another name, but don't worry. Hisashi Midoriya is about to buy a nice house near a very good school. The rest will depend on what you want. You can live there in peace, go to school and continue with your life as is. I will finance your living as I have till now and keep in contact occasionally, but I cannot be present in a way that would risk involving you in my business. It would be an ordinary, possibly lonely at first, but a safe live. That is what Inko would prefer. The last part was a strong argument in Izuku's mind, but going back to almost no contact with his father hurt to just think about. What is the other option? You will enter my life. We will be father and son, but only out of sight. You will know more of what I do and most likely get involved with it sooner or later depending on your choices. I should warn you, this is the more dangerous option. It would make you a villain both legally and in public opinion if our relationship was ever exposed, and that isn't necessarily the most dangerous part. We would have to spend much time together just to train you so you could protect yourself when myself or Kurogiri aren't present. You would still live in the house and go to school. So those are my choices, Izuku said, looking down in deep thought. Yes, details might be flexible to a point, but those are the two paths in front of you. Well, you could always decide you don't want to be involved with me at all. There are already bank accounts under your name so you won't be left empty-handed if you want to walk away. No, Izuku blurted out as his head bounced up. The two options had forced him to really think about them, but the third, he was physically unable to even consider it. He hadn't even thought about money. His father and Kurogiri were everything he cared about that he still had left. As that thought hit him, his arm snaked around his father's and held onto it like the man would disappear otherwise. He had made his decision. People already call me a villain. I would rather be a villain with you than continue being treated like one alone. You should know that I am a harsh trainer. You will need my healing quirks many times. Izuku gulped. I told you, it will be a dangerous life. If I need to be harsh to keep you alive, I will. Do you think you will be up to it? Yes, Izuku responded. There was a time when I wanted to become a pro hero, back when I was still quirkless. If I was going to train and do what that would take, I should survive getting proper training with one. Very well. We will start with the quirks you took. Considering your past experiences, it will be easier if you present one of them as your quirk at your new school. It will probably help. Even if someone is nice, it wouldn't be for the real me. You have a few days to choose how you want to do it. It will take at least that long to arrange your transfer and prepare the house. Can I ask where you are sending me? Not that anywhere wouldn't be better than Aldera. Of course, I am arranging for you to attend Somei Private Academy for rest of the year. Somei, Izuku mumbled, isn't it? Prestigious, expensive and selective, his father answered. After being absent for so long, how could I offer you anything but the best? I would ask how you can pull off an admittance to such a school, but I could just as well ask how you got this apartment. In time perhaps. Now, you need something to focus your attention on before crying again. Would you like to continue practicing with the quirks? Whatever you choose, you will need to make them yours. Yeah, Izuku said, and a memory hit him. Yesterday I destroyed all my All Might stuff with it. I won't complain about that. No, I mean ... and quat. Izuku brought his arm up and made the dragon blade appear. When I was using it, it changed somehow. One moment it just burns without really cutting like when you taught me to control it, then suddenly it felt completely different. I was carving out the wall behind the shelves I wanted to destroy, and it felt easy, like I could have cut through a lot more. But to do that, it would need to be thinner. But that alone wouldn't. Interesting, either there is more to that quirk than we thought, his father said, making Izuku pause his muttering, or you are already well ahead of my lessons. What do you mean? Didn't I tell you yesterday that I would teach you how to combine and use multiple quirks simultaneously? The other quirk you got was a form of vibration quirk. It may appear simple on the surface, but the simplest quirks often make for the most powerful combinations by altering effects of other quirks. For example, I have a quirk called spring-like limbs. On its own it can give me slight enhancements to agility and force of my punches as well as the ability to absorb impacts, but combined with other quirks it allows me to push their power past the limits that my body could not handle otherwise. For you, the application of high-speed vibration could explain enhanced cutting ability. What I am surprised by is that you could achieve simultaneous use so soon without even intending it. That is amazing. Izuku's eyes widened, and for the first time that day it was not to cry. Most quirks have weaknesses or side effects, but if another quirk can counter that, I'll have to rewrite all of my quirk notes. Strength quirk with body hardening quirk, or maybe flight. Water quirk could help focus electricity better than most of them can, or maybe. Then again, his father interrupted Izuku's muttering again. Maybe I should not be surprised. If Kurogiri is right, you are a bigger quirk nerd than myself. He smiled to Izuku behind his breathing mask. Enough talk. Would you like to try it right now? Yes, Izuku said with a smile of his own, not even close to the widest it could have been, but the distraction was welcome. He needed something to do, and training with his dad sounded like just the thing. Well, it seems like we've come to the end of all for some chapters 4 through 6, but anyways part 3 to Senju Naruto should be posted after this. Anyways, have a wonderful day/night, bye.